Amara grew up in Makondo, a quiet little village in Uganda, where life was simple and every day was tied to the land. Her family were farmers, rising with the sun to tend to their crops, sharing meals cooked over fire, and finding joy in the small things. Songs in the evening, laughter under the stars. Amara loved the rhythm of her village life, but she also carried dreams bigger than the fields she knew. It was during a trip to Kampala that she met Tay. He was everything she was not, confident, polished, a banker from a wealthy family. His suits seemed to shine, and his smile was the kind that made people stop and listen. To Amara's surprise, he noticed her, spoke to her, and kept coming back. Against all odds, their worlds collided, and soon the two fell in love. With him, Amara felt seen in a way she hadn't before, and she believed love could bridge the gap between where she came from and where he stood. But not everyone saw it that way. Tay's friends, used to luxury and privilege, often mocked Amara's simple background. They laughed at her village accent, teased her clothes, and whispered that she wasn't his level. Amara heard their words, and though they stung, she held her head high, telling herself that love mattered more than status. Still, deep inside, she wondered if their laughter was a shadow of something much larger, a wall between her world and his that love alone might not tear down. One evening, under the glowing lights of Kampala, Tay finally went down on one knee and asked Amara to marry him. For a moment, her heart raced with pure joy. This was the man she loved, the one who made her believe that even a girl from a small farming village could dream beyond her fields. She said yes, her voice trembling with excitement. But then, almost before she could catch her breath, his smile shifted into something more serious. Amara, he said softly, if we are to have a future together, you must adapt to my world. My family, my friends, my work, everything about my life is different from yours. You must learn how to talk, how to dress, how to behave like a city woman. Otherwise, people won't accept you. The words cut deep. She forced herself to smile, but inside, her joy began to tangle with fear. She wondered why her love wasn't enough, why her true self wasn't enough. Still, she nodded. She loved Tay, and she wanted to believe that these changes were only small sacrifices for something bigger. From that day, Tay became her teacher. He took her shopping for dresses he thought were modern enough. He corrected her whenever she slipped into her village accent. At dinners, he whispered reminders about how to sit, how to hold her fork, how to laugh politely without sounding too loud. Each correction chipped away at her confidence, yet she stayed quiet, swallowing her discomfort. At night, when she was alone, she missed her grandmother's dress stitched with bright embroidery, the taste of roasted maize by the fire, the freedom of speaking without thinking of every word. But whenever Tay looked at her with pride after she passed one of his lessons, she convinced herself it was worth it. She told herself that love demanded patience, and that someday he would see she had given everything. Still, a small voice inside whispered a warning. If love required her to erase who she was, would she ever truly belong in his world? Amara pushed the thought away, holding on to the hope that love could cover every crack between their two worlds. For now, she would endure. For now, she would believe. One afternoon, as they walked through the busy streets of Kampala, Tay told Amara that he wanted her to join him for a dinner with his closest friends. It's important, he said. These are people I grew up with, people who matter in my world. I want them to see you. Amara's heart skipped. She had met some of his friends before, and she knew how their eyes often lingered on her with quiet judgment. But this was different. A dinner, at a fine restaurant in the heart of the city, was no small thing. She wanted to make Tay proud. She wanted them to see what he saw in her. Still, fear lingered in her chest. Would they mock her again? Would she embarrass him? The night before, she went through her clothes slowly, touching each piece with uncertain hand. She had the new dresses Tay had bought for her, shiny fabrics that felt strange against her skin. But at the very bottom of her trunk lay another dress, one stitched by her late grandmother. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't modern. It was modest, simple, but every thread carried love. Bright embroidery ran along the edges, patterns from her culture that told stories of home. When she held it against her chest, she felt her grandmother's spirit, like a shield around her. On the evening of the dinner, Amara chose that dress. She looked in the mirror, her hair neatly tied, her grandmother's embroidery glowing in soft colors. She whispered to herself, "This is me." She hoped Tay would understand. When Tay saw her, his face froze for a moment. "You look nice," he said, though his eyes flickered with something unspoken. She held his arm tightly, hoping he would feel her determination. As they drove through the glowing streets of Kampala, Amara's hands trembled in her lap. She had never been inside such places before, where cars lined up in shining rows and laughter spilled out from grand buildings. But she told herself she wasn't just a village girl tonight. She was Tay's fiancé, a woman carrying the love and prayers of her family, dressed in the strength of her heritage. When they entered the restaurant, the clink of glasses and soft music surrounded her. Men in sharp suits and women in dazzling gowns turned to look. Amara lowered her eyes for a second but then lifted them again, her grandmother's voice echoing in her memory. Walk tall, child. Your worth is not in their eyes but in your heart. With every step into that glowing room, Amara's nerves battled with pride. She wanted to prove she belonged, but more than that, she wanted to stay true to herself. And so she walked in quietly, carrying both her fears and her strength stitched into every thread of her grandmother's dress. The dinner began with soft music, glasses clinking, and laughter rolling around the table. Amara sat beside Tay, her back straight, her smile gentle but nervous. She tried to follow the conversations, though the words often felt too fast, too sharp, filled with jokes and references she didn't fully understand. Still, she kept nodding politely, her hands folded neatly on her lap, reminding herself she was here to make Tay proud. At first, Tay held her hand, but as the wine flowed and the laughter grew louder, something changed. One of his friends made a joke about people from the villages, and instead of brushing it aside, Tay leaned in and smirked. Well, you know, he said, pointing casually at Amara. She can tell you all about that life. She still thinks a chicken running across the road is news. The table burst into laughter. Amara froze. She forced a small smile, hoping it was just a harmless joke, but her chest tightened. It didn't stop there. A little later, as Amara spoke carefully about how farming worked back home, Tay cut her off with a laugh. Ah, listen to her village wisdom, he said, exaggerating her accent so everyone could hear. His friends chuckled again, though a few shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One woman lowered her eyes, stirring her glass as if wishing she weren't there. Amara felt the sting of shame burning her cheeks. Her hands trembled under the table, hidden in the folds of her dress. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the embroidery her grandmother had stitched. The dress had once felt like a shield, but under Tay's laughter, it suddenly felt like a target. When the waiter poured more wine, Tay leaned close to his friends and whispered loudly enough for Amara to hear. I'm teaching her how to survive in the city. Can you imagine? Before me, she thought Kampala was a different country. The table roared again. Every word was like a knife twisting inside her. She swallowed hard, forcing the tears back. She would not cry here, not in front of them. Instead, she sat silent, her eyes fixed on the plate in front of her. Her fingers dug into her palm beneath the table, a quiet fight to keep her composure. Through it all, she noticed the silence of a few. Not everyone laughed. Some shifted in their chairs, glancing at her with something close to pity, others with guilt. But no one spoke up. The night dragged on, each laugh at her expense pulling her deeper into humiliation. She told herself to endure, to survive just a little longer. But inside, something heavy was breaking, and she wondered if the man she loved was the same one who now mocked her for the very roots that made her who she was. The night was already heavy for Amara, but the moment that broke her came without warning. The laughter at the table had softened, the air filled with the clink of glasses and the smell of roasted meat. Tay leaned back in his chair, his voice louder now, the wine loosening his tongue. Then, as if she were invisible, he waved his hand toward her. Amara, go get more drinks for everyone, he said. His tone wasn't gentle. It wasn't even a request. It was the sharp command of someone speaking to a maid. For a second, Amara froze. Her chest tightened, and her throat felt dry. Around the table, a few friends glanced at her, waiting to see what she would do. Some smirked, others looked away, pretending to be too busy with their food. Her face burned with shame, but she stood slowly, nodding without a word. She walked toward the bar, her modest dress brushing softly against her legs. Each step felt heavy, like she was carrying the weight of every mocking laugh, every whisper about her being too village. She told herself to stay calm, to endure. But deep inside, something was cracking. As she waited for the drinks, she heard Tay's voice again. His laughter rose above the music. You see, I rescued her from poverty, he told his friends proudly. If it wasn't for me, she'd still be chasing goats in the village. The words cut deeper than anything before. Amara's hands tightened around the tray, her knuckles pale against the wood. She had always believed Tay saw her heart, her spirit, her worth beyond money and status. But tonight, he was showing the truth. To him, she was a project, a story to boast about, not a partner to stand beside him. When she turned back to the table with the drinks, her eyes were glassy though no tears fell. She placed each glass carefully in front of his friends, her hands steady though inside she was trembling. Tay barely looked at her, still laughing, still telling his story of how he had lifted her out of nothing. In that moment, Amara felt two things at once: the deepest humiliation she had ever known, and a small spark of something else, a strength quietly rising within. She realized she could not stay silent forever. She realized her dignity, though bruised, was not gone. But she stayed quiet for now, swallowing her pain like she always did. She sat back down beside him, her body present, her heart distant. No one around the table knew that inside her, A storm was beginning to build, and it would not be contained much longer. The dinner dragged on, and Amara sat quietly, her heart still aching from Tay's words. She tried to fade into the background, letting the conversations swirl around her. Most of the talk was about money, politics, and business deals, worlds far from the soil of Macondo village. She listened without speaking, her fingers tracing the embroidery on her grandmother's dress beneath the table, a small comfort in a room that felt so hostile. Then, almost by chance, the conversation shifted. Senator Baiko, a heavy-set man with a deep voice, leaned forward and said, "The government is starting a new project on rural development. Farming communities are struggling, and we're looking for ideas. But the truth is, most of us here don't know what life in those villages is really like." The table laughed lightly at his honesty, glasses clinking again. That was when something stirred in Amara. For the first time that night, she felt a pull stronger than her fear. She knew this world. She lived it. She carried it in her bones. "Excuse me," she said softly, almost unsure if she should speak. A few heads turned toward her. Tay stiffened beside her, his eyes narrowing in warning. But she took a breath and continued. "I grew up in a village. I know the struggles of farmers, not from reports or papers, but from the soil itself." At first, the reaction was laughter. A few of Tay's friends chuckled, rolling their eyes as if to say, what could she possibly know? Tay himself gave a short, embarrassed laugh, muttering, "Here we go again with the village wisdom." But Amara did not stop. Her voice grew steadier, clearer. She spoke of how unpredictable rains ruined harvests, how families went hungry even after working endless hours in the fields. She explained how farmers often sold their crops for little money because they lacked proper storage or fair markets. She told them about children missing school during planting seasons, about mothers walking miles to fetch water. Slowly, the laughter began to fade. The room grew quieter, the clinking of glasses stilled. Amara's words, simple and honest, began to paint a picture no report could capture. She spoke with the kind of authority that comes from living the truth, from carrying it every day. Senator Baiko leaned in, his eyes fixed on her. "Go on," he said, his voice lower now, almost respectful. Encouraged, Amara continued, sharing small but powerful solutions she had seen in her village, like community seed banks, shared tools, and the wisdom of crop rotation passed down through generations. Her hands moved as she spoke, her eyes bright, her pain forgotten. For the first time that night, she was not shrinking. She was shining. When she finally paused, the room was silent. Not mocking, not dismissive, silent in a way that carried weight. Even those who had laughed earlier were now staring at her, caught off guard by the strength in her voice. Amara lowered her eyes, her heart racing, unsure if she had said too much. But deep inside, she felt something shift. For the first time, she had not hidden. She had spoken her truth, and they had listened. Amara sat with her heart pounding, the weight of many eyes on her. She thought she had said enough, but Senator Baiko leaned forward again and asked, "Tell us more. What would you do differently if you were in charge of rural development?" His question gave her courage, and the words began to flow from a place she had held silent for too long. She spoke about sustainable farming, about how the soil needed to be cared for, not abused. She explained how villagers understood the land better than anyone, but they lacked tools, training, and support. "If we keep farming the way we do without planning for tomorrow," she said, her voice steady, "the soil will die, and so will our future." The table leaned in closer. Even those who had mocked her earlier were quiet now. Amara's voice grew stronger as she talked about food security, about children who went hungry while nearby farms produced crops that rotted because they couldn't reach the market in time. She described how one simple storage facility in her village had saved hundreds of families from hunger. "It's not about giving charity," she said, her hands moving as if to shape the ideas in the air. "It's about giving farmers a chance to stand on their own feet." Tay shifted uncomfortably beside her. He cleared his throat and tried to laugh. "All right, Amara, that's enough," he said, reaching for her hand under the table. But she gently pulled away and kept speaking, her eyes fixed on the faces listening to her. She explained the economics of village life in a way that no textbook could. She painted pictures of women waking at dawn to dig in the fields, of men walking long distances to sell their crops only to return with coins barely enough to buy salt. Yet she also showed the strength of the community, how neighbors shared tools, food, and hope even when they had nothing. By now, the room was silent except for her voice. The clinking of glasses had stopped. The whispers had faded. Amara was no longer the quiet village girl they mocked. She was a teacher, a leader, a voice for the people they often ignored. When she finally stopped, there was a pause, like the room was holding its breath. Then suddenly applause broke out. First a few claps, then louder, until the entire room was on its feet. The sound filled the air, powerful and undeniable. Senator Baiko stood, his face lit with admiration. "This woman," he said, his voice booming over the applause, speaks more sense than half the people in Parliament." The words rang out like a declaration, lifting Amara higher than she ever imagined. Tay's face turned pale. His forced smile slipped, his pride crumbling in front of everyone. He had wanted to showcase her as his project, someone he had rescued. Instead, she had risen on her own, leaving him in the shadows. Amara sat quietly, her heart racing, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, truly seen. The applause still echoed in the room when Tay pushed back his chair. His face was stiff, his jaw tight, and his eyes burned with something between anger and shame. He couldn't bear it. Amara, the girl he had once treated as a student, was now the center of admiration. The very friends who used to laugh at her with him were now clapping for her, their eyes shining with respect. "Enough," he muttered under his breath, but no one heard him over the thunder of claps. He stood suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. The laughter and applause softened as heads turned toward him. "I think we've all had enough speeches for one night," he said, forcing a smile that fooled no one. His voice cracked, his charm gone. He tried to laugh, but it came out hollow. Without waiting for anyone to respond, he turned and strode quickly toward the door. Amara watched silently, her heart a mix of sadness and clarity. She hadn't wanted to embarrass him. She had only spoken her truth. But now the truth stood like a mirror before him, and he couldn't face it. As Tay reached the door, his steps faltered. His shoulders slumped, and before anyone could react, his body gave way. He collapsed to the floor with a heavy thud. Gasps filled the room. Chairs screeched as his friends rushed forward. "Tay!" one of them shouted, kneeling beside him. Another loosened his tie, patting his face. Someone else called for water. The once confident, polished banker now lay weak and trembling, his pride shattered along with his body. Amara did not move at first. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, her breath shallow. Part of her wanted to run to him, the man she had once loved so deeply. But another part of her knew this collapse was not only of his body, it was the breaking of the arrogance he had carried like armor. Around him, his friends fussed and whispered. Yet their eyes were different now. No one looked at him with the same respect. No one admired him. They had seen the truth. The proud man who mocked others was fragile, weaker than the woman he tried to belittle. Senator Biko stood a little apart, his eyes shifting from Tay to Amara. He didn't rush forward. He didn't join the flurry of panic. He simply watched with quiet understanding, as though he already knew this night would end this way. At last, they lifted Tay to a chair, fanning him with napkins. His face was pale, his voice shaky as he tried to insist he was fine. But no amount of words could undo what had just been revealed. His collapse was not only physical, it was public, humiliating, and unforgettable. The room no longer belonged to him. The applause that had once risen for Amara still lingered in the air, and the respect he craved had slipped forever out of his hand. The dinner ended in whispers and uneasy glances, but for Amara, something had shifted forever. She had walked into that room as the quiet girl everyone underestimated, yet she had walked out carrying a new kind of power, one she hadn't even known lived inside her. The very next day, word spread across Kampala about the girl from Makondo village who had silenced a table full of wealthy elites with her wisdom. People spoke about the way she stood her ground, how her words cut deeper than any polished speech. In cafes, in offices, even in market stalls, her name began to surface. She was no longer just Tay's fiancé. She was Amara, the village girl who made the rich listen. Senator Biko sought her out soon after. He met her in a quiet cafe, away from the noise of the city. His eyes were warm, his voice steady. "Amara," he said, "your voice is rare. You speak with knowledge, not from books, but from life itself. That is the kind of voice we need." Then, without hesitation, he offered her a seat on his Rural Development Committee. For a moment, Amara was speechless. Just weeks ago, she had been learning how to hold a fork the right way to fit into Tay's world. Now, she was being invited to shape ideas that could change the lives of farmers like her family. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not from pain. They were from pride. News of the offer spread quickly, adding fuel to the story that was already alive in the city. People admired her courage. Women in the markets called her an inspiration. Young girls whispered her name with hope, seeing themselves in her journey. She had become a symbol, not of shame, but of strength. Meanwhile, Tay faded into silence. He avoided the stares of those who once admired him. No one forgot how he had mocked her, only to be overshadowed by the very woman he tried to silence. His arrogance was exposed, and Amara no longer needed his approval to feel worthy. For the first time, Amara looked at her life without him at the center. She saw the fields of Makondo, the faces of her family, the children running barefoot with laughter in their eyes. She realized her strength was not something Tay had given her. It had been there all along, waiting for her to claim it. Each step she took in Kampala after that felt lighter, stronger. She no longer bowed her head in shame. She spoke freely, her voice steady, her heart certain. She was not just surviving in Tay's world anymore. She was building her own. Amara had found her place, not as someone's shadow, but as her own light. And deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of her rise. When Amara returned to Macondo, the whole village gathered to welcome her. Word of her courage had traveled faster than she ever imagined. To the people, she was no longer just a farmer's daughter. She was a role model, proof that even a village girl's voice could echo in the halls of power. Children ran to her with wide smiles, women hugged her tightly, and the elders nodded with pride, whispering blessings over her. In the middle of all this joy, Tay arrived quietly. His face no longer carried the arrogance she once knew. He looked tired, humbled, almost desperate. He pulled her aside and spoke softly. "Amara, I made mistakes. I was foolish. But I love you. Please, let's start again." For a moment, her heart wavered. This was the man she had once dreamed of marrying, the man she had loved deeply. But as she looked at him now, she felt no pull, no need for his approval. His words sounded empty compared to the strength she had found in herself. She shook her head gently. "Tay," she said, her voice calm, "you wanted me to change for you. But I've learned I don't need to change for anyone. Not anymore." She walked away, not in anger but in peace. Around her, the children ran in circles, laughing, tugging at her hands, pulling her into their game. She lifted her head toward the horizon, the setting sun casting a golden glow on her face. Amara stood tall, her smile bright and steady. She was no longer the girl who hid her tears. She was the woman who carried her village's hope, her own dignity, and a future filled with promise. And this time, she was walking forward alone, but never lonely.